First off, we go across the Atlantic Ocean and past Europe into the Middle East, where the world's most popular religion first began. As you know, Christianity is believed to be the most followed religion in the world. However, in this case, Jesus wasn't crucified. He was stabbed to death by a Jewish mob that consisted of Jewish officials. Without Jesus' crucifixion, there was no symbol for Christianity. There was no cross, and Jesus was never put in a tomb. Instead, his body was thrown into the river of Jordan by the same Jewish mob due to the disgrace they felt he was to their religion. Christianity slowly but steadily crumbled away after Jesus died around 33 CE for multiple reasons. First, due to the fact that Christianity started in Jerusalem, the religion never reached the Americas and barely touched Europe. All 12 disciples gave up on spreading the messages they wrote down because nobody was interested in following their religion. Also, their fear of getting murdered by the same Jewish mob led them to flee as far away from Jerusalem as possible. Paul the Apostle was never able to write down his scripture, which meant the Bible was non-existent, and the written content of Christianity was spread out along with the disciples. There was no understanding of an afterlife or a resurrection. There was no symbol or story of redemption to follow due to his surprise murder. The words of Jesus spread to small areas in the Middle East and spread partly into the Mediterranean region where the missionaries left had made it. A few years after Jesus' death, many of his followers decided to convert back to Judaism, as this was the most popular religion at the time. The Christians in the Middle East decided to convert to Judaism as well, due to their interest in a monotheistic religion, and it made more sense to them because there were hardly any pieces of scripture to base their Christian beliefs on. About 30 years after Jesus' death, Judaism was the only monotheistic religion competing for world dominance, and Jesus was seen as a disgrace to the Jewish religion, and the only people who talked about him were those who were old enough to tell the tales of his life, and the disciples who followed him to the end. By the year 100, Jesus' name was almost completely forgotten, and Judaism was the most dominating religion throughout the Middle East and the Mediterranean region. There were no other competing monotheistic religions against Judaism, except for Islam, which wasn't recognized until the 7th century. This meant that the Jews experienced years of peace and prosperity as no one was around to stop them. Next up, we go all the way over to Europe, where most of World War II took place.
World War II started in the early 20th century and ended in the mid-20th century. The Axis powers, which consisted of Germany, Italy, and Japan. These three countries were recently struggling in the world economy, which allowed their leaders to take control using the country's anger to strike the countries surrounding their borders. The main resistance these countries found was from the Allied powers, which consisted of the US, England, France, Canada, and Russia. New weapons and fighting strategies were used in World War II, like tanks and the strategic bombing techniques. The U.S. eventually used the atomic bomb on Japan to stop the fighting later forced Germany to surrender. After World War II, the Cold War began between the U.S. and the USSR, and democracy and capitalism became the world's political and economic powerhouses. In this alternate universe, 5 key events were changed. First, D-Day was not successful. This would have caused the US to lose morale pulling out of the war in Europe. This took out a huge threat in Europe, allowing Germany to focus more on Russia and England. Germany then would have continued bombing England, weakening their military. The Nazi forces then would begin to slowly invade England. This slow push into London would destroy much of the farmland and industrialized area, which in turn would demolish the English economy. With impending genocide, Churchill would be forced to surrender to the Nazis and would begin rebuilding the destroyed land. With no major opposing force in the West, the German forces would put more focus and effort into the battle with Russia. In this universe, the Germans would push the Russians back into Siberia and would stop at Kiev. This would allow Germans to set up a border and pose as a constant threat to Russia. As Germany takes over Europe, the US would continue fighting in Japan and the Pacific. In this universe, the Japanese successfully stopped the U.S. island hopping techniques. This would have given the Japanese time to regroup and begin to push the U.S. back to their borders. The U.S. then would threaten to nuke Japan to stop their progress. With Germany as a superpower in Europe, they then could focus more to advance scientific and technological military strategies, which would allow them to develop their own atomic bomb. In turn, this would discourage the U.S. from bombing Japan because Germany had the power to bomb them. This would create a stalemate between the U.S. and the Axis powers, which would be similar to the Cold War. Again, the U.S. would be one major power in this battle, but the key difference is that Germany would replace the USSR's place in the war. Another key difference in this universe's Cold War would be that instead of it being mainly fought in the Middle East and Asia, the new Cold War would be fought in South America and Central America. In this Cold War, the US and Canada would fight against European powerhouses, England, France, and Germany, and their allies, Japan and Mexico. This would lead to democracy and capitalism to fall to what seemed like the more superior system of fascism and socialism. The US would continue to fight in South America to prevent German authority from coming close to the US. Another motivation for them to prolong the war with Germany would be because of the vast amounts of natural resources located in South America. With Germany and Japan controlling most of Afro-Eurasia, many natural resources would be under their control. In an effort to weaken the U.S., they would have cut off trade. This would limit the resources the U.S. had access to, forcing them to fight for the control of South American resources. As the U.S. put all their attention into fighting in South America, Germany could create more advances in science and technology. By about the 1990s, Germany would have made major progresses in technology while the US would have been stuck in the 50s. This gap in technology would have allowed the Germans and Japanese to successfully invade the US. Germany would have taken control of the majority of the land, only allowing Japanese to rule over the far west coast. The Germans would try to oppress the American people, but uprisings and protesting would be frequent across the nation. During the 21st century, the Germans would begin a war with Japan. Japan, who still would be inferior to the Nazi regime. In this war, Germany would not hesitate to boast their advances in nuclear warfare. Japan would quickly surrender due to the fact that they could still not produce a nuclear weapon, and the mainland of Japan was demolished by consistent nuclear bombing from Japan. Germany would now control most of the world and would bring new ideologies and spread new cultures across the world. They would put much emphasis on further advances in technology and mathematics. They soon would show favor to the US and Northern Europeans. This would give these areas much funding and political power. People from Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and South America would most likely have been placed in the lower social class. The Russian and Polish people would most likely have been enslaved and forced to perform most physical labor around the world.